Who's the stupidest person you've ever met, and what story perfectly sums up their stupidity? She paused for dramatic effect, clearly expecting us to grasp the gravity of this situation. When met with blank stares, she elaborated with what she apparently thought was the smoking gun. The water was warm. Let that sink in for a moment. Here was a future science teacher, someone who would soon be responsible for enlightening young minds about the natural world, expressing genuine concern that she had become pregnant from swimming in a heated pool that happened to contain members of the opposite sex. It was like watching someone worry about catching algebra from a calculator. The situation escalated when she revealed her preventive measures. She had immediately gone home and drank an entire bottle of lemon juice because the acid kills things. At this point, several of us had to physically bite our tongues to maintain professional composure. One student actually had to leave the room, their shoulders shaking with what I'm sure was concern. But the real cherry on top of this biological misunderstanding Sunday? She was wearing a swimsuit the entire time. When someone finally pointed this out, she responded with the kind of confidence only true ignorance can inspire. But it might have seeped through. It was really warm water. As future educators gathered in that lounge, we watched in collective amazement as she Google searched, "Can you get pregnant from swimming pool?" The relief on her face when she read the results was palpable, though it was quickly replaced by embarrassment as the full weight of her misconception dawned on her. The epilogue to this tale? Jessica did eventually graduate and become a science teacher. Last I heard, she was teaching middle school biology and had developed a particularly thorough and detailed unit on human reproduction. Sometimes the best teachers are those who learn from their own spectacular misunderstandings. To this day, whenever I hear someone complain about sex education in schools, I think about Jessica and her warm pool pregnancy panic. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the most important lessons are learned outside the classroom, preferably before you're the one teaching in it. Story 14, The Anti-Vaxxers' Clay Crusade. Meet Karen, a woman whose approach to medical science made medieval plague doctors look cutting edge. She was the kind of person who believed essential oils could cure everything from a stubbed toe to existential dread, and whose medical research consisted entirely of Facebook memes and YouTube videos with titles like "The Truth Big Pharma Doesn't Want You to Know." Her crowning achievement in alternative medicine came when she discovered the healing powers of clay. Not just any clay, mind you, but special detoxifying clay that she ordered from a website that looked like it was designed during the dial-up era. According to Karen's extensive research, 3 hours of scrolling through Pinterest, this miracle clay could draw out toxins, negative energy, and government tracking devices, though she was a bit vague on the exact mechanism for any of these claims. Karen's clay crusade reached its peak when she decided to treat her son's seasonal allergies with what she called a full-body clay cleanse. Picture, if you will, a suburban mom slathering her confused 12-year-old son in gray mud like she was preparing him for some sort of New Age warrior ritual. The poor kid looked like a living statue having an existential crisis. But the real masterpiece of misguided maternal care came when she decided that internal application would be even more effective. She started mixing clay into everything, smoothies, sandwiches, even the kid's birthday cake. "It's all natural," she'd proclaim, as if natural was synonymous with good for you. By that logic, poison ivy should be a salad topping. The situation reached its climax when she attended a parent-teacher conference covered head to toe in dried clay, looking like a garden statue that had achieved sentience and decided to discuss her son's math grades. The teacher, displaying admirable professional composure, managed to conduct the entire meeting without commenting on the fact that Karen was literally shedding clay dust all over the classroom furniture. Her crusade against modern medicine extended to all aspects of life. When her son scraped his knee, instead of using antiseptic, she applied a clay poultice that made him look like he was wearing a gray knee-high sock. For headaches, she'd create a clay crown that made her look like she was auditioning for a low-budget post-apocalyptic film. The turning point came during a summer heat wave when Karen's clay mask literally began to crack and peel in the sun, as pieces of her healing mask flaked off during a neighborhood barbecue. She maintained that this was actually a sign the clay was drawing out the toxins. One neighbor kindly suggested that maybe it was just, drying clay doing what drying clay does, but Karen insisted the clay was responding to negative energies. The final straw was when she tried to convince the school nurse to replace the first aid kit with what she called her healing clay emergency kit. The nurse, who had apparently developed the patience of a saint dealing with Karen, politely declined while trying not to stare at the gray smudges Karen was leaving on every surface she touched. These days, Karen has moved on to other alternative treatments. Last I heard, she was investigating the healing properties of crystals and trying to convince people that moonlight could charge their immune systems. Her son, now a teenager, has developed a remarkably normal relationship with modern medicine, though he still flinches slightly at the sight of pottery classes. The clay phase may be over, But Karen's legacy lives on in the form of gray stains on various surfaces around town. Silent testimonials to the time when one woman decided that the answer to all of life's problems was to cover everything in mud. Sometimes I wonder if she ever realized that her detoxifying clay was essentially the same stuff used in cat litter, just with better marketing and a much higher price tag. Story 15. The Movie Theater Mystic. Let me tell you about Kevin, a self-proclaimed psychic whose connection to reality was about as stable as a house of cards in a hurricane. Working with him at the local movie theater was like having a front-row seat to an ongoing performance art piece that blended delusion, drama, and unintentional comedy in equal measure. Kevin's most remarkable trait was his unwavering belief in his own psychic abilities, which manifested in predictions that were about as accurate as a chocolate sundial. His proudest premonition centered around the return of our ancient Coke machines, relics that had been scrapped for parts years before he even joined our staff. When informed that these machines had long since been recycled into scrap metal, he'd simply tap his temple with a knowing smile and declare, "The spirits have shown me their return." I'm still waiting for those spirits to explain the logistics of reassembling machines that had probably already been reincarnated as Toyota parts. His delusions of grandeur reached new heights during the premiere of Justice League. Kevin arrived in what he claimed was a professionally crafted Superman costume that looked suspiciously like pajamas from Target with a bath towel cape. When 6 other moviegoers showed up in store-bought costumes, Kevin strutted around the lobby like a peacock who'd just invented feathers, proudly proclaiming that he had started a worldwide cosplay movement. The fact that people had been dressing up for movie premieres since before he was born somehow escaped his psychic awareness. Time management was another concept that existed in a different dimension for Kevin. His first day of orientation was scheduled for 5 p.m., but he sauntered in at 10 p.m., having walked across town because, and I quote, "I didn't think of leaving earlier." When asked why he didn't call for a ride or take a bus, he explained that he had sensed it would be a nice day for a walk. Apparently, his psychic powers didn't extend to basic planning skills or weather forecasting, as it had been raining for the past 3 hours. Later that week, he transformed what should have been a 15-minute break into an epic 2-hour odyssey. When my coworker finally tracked him down, his explanation was delivered with the serene confidence of a Zen master. I had a vision that the line would be long. The fact that he could have seen the actual line by simply looking through the window before deciding to spend his entire break there apparently didn't occur to him. But my personal favorite was his confident declaration about the original Jumanji movie. According to our resident film historian, it was supposed to be about a video game, but since video games hadn't been invented yet, they scratched the idea. When someone pointed out that video games had been around since the 1970s, he simply smiled and said, "That's what they want you to think." Who they were and why they would want to hide the invention date of video games remained a mystery that even his psychic powers couldn't unravel. The last time I saw Kevin, he was explaining to a bewildered customer how he had psychically predicted the ending of a movie he hadn't seen yet, a feat somewhat undermined by the fact that he'd been working at the theater for 3 months and had already seen it twice. He since moved on to pursue his dream of becoming a professional psychic consultant to Hollywood, though I suspect his greatest contribution to the film industry will remain his unintentionally comedic interpretations of movie history. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, confidently predicting the return of obsolete vending machines and rewriting film history one misguided fact at a time. Though I have to admit, in a world where reality often seems stranger than fiction, perhaps Kevin was just ahead of his time, or behind it, or sideways to it. With Kevin, it was always hard to tell. Story 16. The Frat Party Lifeguard Chronicles. Against my better judgment, and despite numerous warnings from concerned friends, I once accepted a lifeguarding gig at a frat party. The pay was good, and I had just renewed my certifications, so I foolishly thought to myself, how bad could it be? The answer, as it turned out, was somewhere between disaster movie and cautionary tale. The star of this aquatic circus was a particularly intoxicated gentleman who seemed determined to test the limits of both physics and my patience. He first approached me while I was on duty, repeatedly offering me drinks, apparently unaware that alcohol and lifeguarding mix about as well as oil and water. When I declined, he decided to demonstrate his alpha male status by smashing an unopened beer can against his forehead, a move that resulted in exactly what any sober person would expect. A bleeding head wound that made him look less like a tough guy and more like an extra from a low-budget horror movie. But Chad, bless his concussed heart, wasn't about to let a little thing like head trauma dampen his party spirit. With blood still trickling down his face like some macabre war paint, he let out a battle cry that would have made a Viking blush and executed what he probably thought was a graceful dive into the 6-foot pool. In reality, it looked more like a drunk penguin attempting parkour while wearing roller skates. My whistleblowing symphony fell on ears as deaf as a rock concert security guards. Chad emerged from the pool, completely baffled by my concern for his safety. Instead of acknowledging his near-death experience, he switched tactics and attempted to flirt with me. Because nothing says date material quite like self-inflicted head trauma and a death wish. The coup de grace came when he realized his precious Ray-Bans had abandoned ship during one of his aquatic misadventures. His solution? Demand that we drain the entire pool to recover his $200 sunglasses. When I pointed out the logistical impossibility of this request, he suggested an alternative. He would hold his breath and search the bottom of the pool himself. Remember, this was the same person who moments ago could barely walk in a straight line. For 3 hours, I watched this walking liability provide a masterclass in poor decision-making, enthusiastically encouraged by his equally inebriated fraternity brothers. Each time I prevented one potential disaster, Chad would innovate a new way to tempt fate. It was like playing a high-stakes game of whack-a-mole where the moles were all drunk and determined to drown. The experience taught me 2 valuable lessons. First, no amount of hazard pay is worth watching someone try to turn a pool party into an episode of 1,000 Ways to Die. And second, when someone warns you about lifeguarding a frat party, believe them. Some warnings don't need to be learned firsthand. Story 17. The Landlord's Cousin from Hell. What started as a simple landlord-tenant dispute evolved into a theatrical production worthy of a low-budget crime drama. The opening act began with a phone call from my landlord, demanding I vacate my apartment immediately because his cousin needed the place. When I reminded him about the small matter of my legally binding lease with 6 months remaining, he seemed to think this was a mere technicality that should bow to family obligations. A few days later, the cousin made his dramatic entrance, letting himself in with a key and aggressively demanding my immediate departure. When I suggested he might want to familiarize himself with tenant rights law or face a conversation with law enforcement, he stormed out in a huff, but not without treating me to an impressive tantrum. Sensing this might not be the end of our little drama, I had the locks changed. Sure enough, our antagonist decided to escalate things by kicking in a window and breaking into the apartment. Because nothing says, I have a right to be here, quite like committing a felony. I was home at the time, and hearing the commotion that sounded like a rhinoceros attempting ballet, immediately dialed 911. In a move that would have made any criminal defense lawyer weep, he grabbed the phone from me mid-call and started yelling at the operator. Yes, you read that correctly. He decided that the best way to avoid legal trouble was to add assault and interfering with an emergency call to his growing list of crimes, all while literally on the phone with the police. When I pointed out that this situation was going to look fantastic, when the police arrived to find him holding my phone in an apartment he'd just broken into, he eventually put it down. But the story doesn't end there. In a twist worthy of M. Night Shyamalan, he decided to call the police himself. I thanked him for his contribution, noting that multiple 911 calls from the same location would only expedite the response time. The drama reached its crescendo when his girlfriend, or sister, the relationship status was as clear as mud, and my girlfriend started their own heated debate about property rights and common decency. The result? For simultaneous 911 calls, creating what must have been an interesting day at the emergency dispatch center. When 6 to 8 officers arrived with weapons drawn, they were treated to the sight of the cousin still insisting that his uncle said he could live there, as if these magic words would somehow negate breaking and entering charges. The look on the officers' faces was priceless, a perfect blend of disbelief and resignation that seemed to say, "We don't get paid enough for this." After showing the police my lease and ID, I thought the final curtain had fallen on this theatrical disaster. But no, the landlord decided to add his own dramatic flourish by shutting off the power and water. After consulting with a lawyer about my rights, I decided that living without heat or running water in the middle of winter, with a broken window and damaged door, wasn't worth the principle of the thing. My exit strategy. I moved out quickly, skipped the last month's rent, didn't clean, and left the fridge full of rotting food. The piece de resistance was a particularly ripe turkey that I'd left to mature like a fine wine. The resulting aroma was my parting gift, a small revenge for a large inconvenience, delivered with all the subtlety of a skunk at a garden party. Story 18. Aaron's Academic Apocalypse. Let me tell you about Aaron, a student whose stupidity was so legendary it deserved its own wing in the Hall of Fame of poor decisions. His first claim to fame came during a school trip to the zoo, where he got into a heated argument with a zookeeper about the nature of tigers. Aaron, you see, was convinced that tigers were simply female lions, a theory he defended with the passionate conviction of a flat earth believer at a NASA convention. The zookeeper, an expert with years of experience studying these magnificent creatures, eventually walked away in defeat, which Aaron, naturally, took as confirmation of his victory. But the piece de resistance of Aaron's academic career occurred during science class. Our regular teacher was out for shoulder surgery, leaving us with a substitute, a highly qualified, non-religious Arab woman. Aaron, demonstrating both his ignorance and racism in one spectacular move, immediately quipped that the bomb-making class was down the hall. The substitute teacher warned him to stop, but Aaron, being Aaron, took this as encouragement to continue his performance. 10 minutes into the lesson, while the substitute was carefully pouring a dangerous chemical mixture, Aaron decided to elevate his act to new heights of idiocy. He suddenly screamed "bomb" at the top of his lungs, causing the teacher to jump and spill the chemicals. The resulting smoke show triggered the emergency evacuation system, sending the entire class fleeing from the room. This proved to be Aaron's grand finale, his third expulsion in 3 years. The cosmic cherry on top? The substitute teacher happened to be married to the vice principal, which effectively sealed his fate. His parents tried every school in the area, but word of his exploits had spread like wildfire, and no institution was willing to risk becoming the next chapter in the Aaron saga. I sometimes wonder if he ever achieved his dream of becoming the world's best police officer. Something tells me that law enforcement agencies might have some reservations about hiring someone who thinks tigers are female lions and thinks it's hilarious to yell "bomb" in a chemistry class. Story 19. The Unorthodox Believer. I once had a friend whose approach to Christianity was, shall we say, uniquely creative. While she didn't quote scripture or condemn people to eternal damnation, traditional hallmarks of the overzealous believer, her particular brand of faith manifested in ways that would have made medieval mystics raise an eyebrow. Picture this. I innocently brought out a deck of tarot cards one day, and you'd have thought I'd summoned a demon in her living room. She erupted into a panic-stricken frenzy, screaming at me to put away these tools of Satan as if the cards might spontaneously combust and open a portal to the underworld. Her medical views were equally fascinating. When I mentioned being misdiagnosed with meningitis when I actually had migraines, she launched into an impassioned sermon about the evils of modern medicine. According to her gospel, prayer and home remedies were the only true path to healing, a philosophy that would have made Hippocrates spin in his grave. But the crown jewel of her family's medical misadventures came after her younger brother's hospital scare. The doctor, doing their due diligence, suspected MPS and ordered tests, even referring him to another hospital just to be thorough. When it turned out to be just an infection, rather than being relieved, she and her equally enlightened mother were outraged that the doctor had dared to consider a more serious diagnosis. Their response? They attempted to sue the doctor for the grievous crime of being too thorough. They even approached my mother for help with their case, but when confronted with actual legal fees and a lawyer's gentle explanation that being a competent doctor isn't grounds for a lawsuit, they quickly abandoned their crusade for justice. I haven't seen her or her family since, and I can't say I miss their unique blend of religious fervor and medical conspiracy theories. Sometimes I wonder if they ever found a doctor willing to diagnose illness through prayer alone, or if they've since discovered that modern medicine might have some merit after all. Story 1. The Kitchen Crisis. Picture this. A peaceful Sunday afternoon suddenly transformed into what my brother and I were convinced was the end of the world, or at least the end of our kitchen. There we were, my brother diligently doing the dishes, a miracle in itself, when the kitchen tap decided to stage a rebellion. No amount of twisting, turning, or desperate pleading could stop the relentless flow of water, which was now rising in the sink with the determination of a tiny indoor tsunami. What followed was a masterclass in teenage panic response. My brother, channeling his inner action hero, began frantically scooping water with our largest pots and pans, splashing more water on himself than in the actual containers. Meanwhile, I was crawling around under the sink like a contortionist, searching for the mythical main water valve while muttering what I'm sure were very creative emergency prayers. The situation reached peak chaos when my brother, in a moment of inspired desperation, decided to use our mom's favorite colander to scoop water, because apparently, in times of crisis, basic physics takes a holiday. As water poured through the holes, the look of betrayal on his face was priceless, as if the colander had personally offended him and his entire family. Finally, my brother dashed off to find our father, leaving me alone in our rapidly developing indoor pool. Dad walked in, took one look at the scene, his 2 children in various states of panic and wetness, and without saying a word, simply reached down and pulled the drain plug. The water began disappearing with a satisfying gurgle, along with our dignity. The look we exchanged in that moment said it all. Sometimes the simplest solution is the one right in front of you, or in this case, right under the rapidly rising water we were so desperately trying to fight. Story 2. The Fashion Victim. Meet my cousin, the living embodiment of privilege meets ignorance, a walking masterclass in how not to adult. Throughout high school, she floated through the halls like fashion royalty, treating her designer wardrobe like disposable tissues while maintaining a GPA that would make a sloth look ambitious. Her crowning achievement? Getting into college in 2014, where she promptly transformed her higher education experience into an extended study of local bar culture. Her boyfriend, a maestro of misguided advice who probably couldn't tell a textbook from a takeout menu, convinced her that education was just a suggestion for people of their social standing. This pearls of wisdom led to her ghosting her classes with the same enthusiasm she showed for spending daddy's money. No formal withdrawal needed. Apparently, college was like a bad Tinder date. If you ignore it long enough, it just goes away. But the true masterpiece of her privileged existence revealed itself during move-out day. As her family helped pack her belongings, her mother noticed a mountain of designer clothes lurking in the corner like a fashionable Everest. "Is that laundry? We can wash it when we get home," her mother offered, displaying the kind of practical thinking that had clearly skipped a generation. My cousin's response: a look of genuine confusion followed by the immortal words, "You can't wash those clothes." Let that sink in. This fashion-forward philosopher had been treating her designer wardrobe like single-use paper plates, discarding perfectly good clothing because the concept of laundry was apparently too plebeian for her refined sensibilities. The plot thickened when we discovered she'd somehow managed to keep her underwear clean, suggesting a selective understanding of laundry that would baffle anthropologists for generations to come. Now living back at home, she attempts to demonstrate her adulting skills through household chores, though she still occasionally tries to throw away clothing that dares to become dirty. The most mind-bending part? Throughout her pre-college years, she regularly wore the same outfits, making her claimed ignorance of laundry as believable as a chocolate teapot. It's like she existed in a parallel universe where clothes magically cleaned themselves, until they didn't. Story 3. The Culinary Catastrophe. During my Navy days, I encountered a cook whose culinary incompetence was so legendary, it could have been classified as a new form of biological warfare. Picture this. A man entrusted with feeding an entire ship's crew, whose signature dish was chicken so rare it could have flown off the plate and rejoined its flock. The man had a special talent for turning any ingredient into a potential health hazard, and his cooking style could best be described as survival of the fittest. His interpretation of cooking basics was like watching someone try to perform brain surgery with a spoon. Meatloaf. In his creative hands, it became a modern art installation. Raw ground beef ceremoniously dumped into a pan, presented with the confidence of a five-star chef unveiling their masterpiece. The crew started calling it murder loaf, not because it could kill you, though it probably could, but because it looked like a crime scene on a plate. But his magnum opus, his true masterpiece of culinary disaster, was the Great Cookie Catastrophe of '98. In a stroke of what he probably thought was genius, he decided to bake sugar cookies for the crew. Simple enough, right? Wrong. Somehow, in a feat that defied both physics and common sense, he managed to confuse salt for sugar, and not just a little bit. He emptied our entire month's supply of salt into what became known as the sodium bombs. The result? Cookies so salty they could have been used to de-ice the deck in winter. The situation became so dire that the captain, in an unprecedented move that probably violated several naval protocols, assigned him a bodyguard, not to protect him from angry sailors, but to protect the sailors from his next culinary experiment. This poor soul's job description essentially became prevent culinary war crimes. The guard would stand there, watching our chef with the same intensity usually reserved for bomb disposal experts, ready to intervene at the first sign of another creative interpretation of a recipe. His cooking became so notorious that other ships' crews would use it as a threat. "Straighten up, or we'll transfer you to the USS our ship's name," became the naval equivalent of "eat your vegetables." We started keeping emergency rations in our bunks, not for actual emergencies, but for regular meal times when he was on duty. The final straw. He managed to burn water. Yes, you read that right. He put a pot of water on to boil and forgot about it so long that the pot actually melted. The incident report probably read like a creative writing assignment. Seaman successfully transformed H2O into WTF. These days, whenever I hear someone say they're a terrible cook, I just smile and think, but can you burn water? Because thanks to our culinary catastrophe in human form, I now have a very, very low bar for what constitutes bad cooking. Story 4. The World's Most Incompetent Criminal. Meet my next-door neighbor, the world's most incompetent criminal. A man whose attempts at lawbreaking were so spectacularly unsuccessful, they should be preserved in a museum of criminal stupidity. Picture a young Ray Liotta lookalike who apparently studied crime from cartoon reruns and thought Ocean's 11 was a documentary. His masterpiece of criminal ineptitude began with what he probably thought was a foolproof plan to rob the Howard Johnsons at the top of our street. After successfully holding up the establishment at gunpoint while wearing a ski mask, his one moment of criminal competence, he made what can only be described as a galaxy-brain decision. He removed his mask and casually strolled home, a mere 2 blocks away, like he was returning from a Sunday morning coffee run. The police, probably trying not to laugh while writing their report, found what I like to call the Trinity of Stupidity in his apartment. The ski mask, still warm from use, the gun, with his fingerprints lovingly preserved, and the stolen money, which he'd helpfully arranged on his coffee table like a display at the Evidence R Us store. When questioned, he looked at the officers with the innocent confusion of a puppy who'd been caught chewing shoes and asked, with complete sincerity, "Would it help if I said I'm sorry?" This performance earned him a 2-year residency at Rikers Island, where you'd think he might have learned something about the art of criminality. But no, like any dedicated artist, he was committed to his craft of spectacular failure. Upon release, he orchestrated his next masterpiece, breaking into a local apartment building. After successfully acquiring some money and jewelry, again, showing those brief, tantalizing flashes of competence, he found himself trapped on the fire escape. The ladder wouldn't descend, and the window behind him had locked shut. He spent 3 hours stuck there, like a very unsuccessful Romeo beneath the wrong balcony, until the police arrived to rescue him right back to prison. But here's the twist that makes this story truly special. Despite his criminal tendencies, he was genuinely one of the nicest guys you'd ever meet. Before his first incarceration, he gifted me a box of cassettes, including the Allman Brothers' Live at the Fillmore, inadvertently introducing me to what would become a lifelong musical passion. He'd help old ladies with their groceries when he wasn't robbing their apartments, and he always remembered everyone's birthdays, even if he celebrated them from behind bars. He was living proof that sometimes the worst criminals make the best neighbors, when they're not busy getting themselves arrested in the most spectacular ways possible. I often wonder if he ever found a career better suited to his unique combination of incompetence and charm. Maybe as a what not to do instructor at a criminal justice school. Story 5, The Self-Destructive Mechanic. Meet Buddy, a man whose approach to life was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. If the train was actively trying to derail itself. As a mechanic, he had the technical skills to fix almost anything, except, ironically, his own life decisions. His financial planning strategy could best be described as, hold my beer and watch this. His masterpiece of fiscal self-destruction began with what he probably thought was a brilliant investment, purchasing a massive Snap-on toolbox for over $3,000 on credit. Now, this might have been a reasonable decision for a professional mechanic, if he hadn't immediately sold it 48 hours later for a mere $1,500 to cover some overdue bills. It was like watching someone buy a house just to use it as firewood. Predictably, Snap-on never saw a dime of their money, though they would eventually become very familiar with his forwarding addresses. But Buddy's true talent wasn't just financial self-sabotage. It was his ability to turn any workplace into a WWE wrestling ring at a moment's notice. His temper was shorter than a matchstick and about as explosive. He had the unique ability to interpret any comment, no matter how innocent, as a personal insult requiring immediate physical retaliation. Good morning could be fighting words if said in the wrong tone. After initiating his 4th fist fight at work, yes, you read that correctly, 4th, he finally exhausted management's patience, which was impressive considering they had the patience of Buddhist monks dealing with a particularly aggressive squirrel. What's truly remarkable is that he managed to sweet-talk his way out of termination 3 times, displaying a level of charm that made you wonder if he was secretly a chaos wizard who could only use his powers for self-destruction. The man's skin was so thin you could probably read a newspaper through it. Once, he launched into a tirade against a security guard, threatening the poor man's job simply because he didn't appreciate his tone of voice. The security guard's crime? Saying, "Please show your ID," instead of, "Would you kindly present your identification, Your Highness?" But the cherry on top of this sundae of incompetence? When asked to perform the simple task of putting caution tape across a malfunctioning gate, his response was a bewildered, "I don't know how." This from a man who could rebuild an engine blindfolded, but apparently found yellow and black striped tape to be an insurmountable engineering challenge. It was like watching a chess grandmaster struggle with tic-tac-toe. The cosmic punchline to this whole saga? One of our co-workers, tired of watching this human disaster in action, tipped off the Snap-on salesman about Buddy's new workplace. This led to wage garnishment, which Buddy took about as well as a cat takes to water aerobics. His reaction was to threaten to fight the entire legal system, though thankfully, he couldn't figure out how to put caution tape around the courthouse. These days, I hear Buddy's working as a bouncer at a local bar, probably the only job where his unique combination of mechanical skills and hair-trigger temper might actually be considered a feature rather than a bug. Though I can't help but wonder if he's tried to fight the bar itself, yet for looking at him funny. Story 6, The Uber Driver Who Couldn't. Imagine, if you will, though my Uber driver certainly couldn't, a ride that transformed from simple transportation into an accidental philosophical experiment about the nature of hypothetical thinking. It was like being trapped in a real-life version of Who's on First, but with a dash of existential crisis thrown in. The moment I entered his car, my driver immediately launched into what would become the most circular conversation of my life. "Are you going to X location?" When I replied in the negative, his response was delivered with the enthusiastic certainty of someone who'd just solved a complex math problem. "Great, because I'm not going to take you to X location." Fair enough, I thought, considering I had no intention of going there. But curiosity got the better of me, a decision I would soon regret with every fiber of my being. What would you have done if I had wanted to go to X location? I asked, unknowingly opening a portal to what I can only describe as the twilight zone of logic. Look, man, he declared with the conviction of someone explaining that water is wet. I'm not going to take you to X location, okay? I told you already. His tone suggested that I was the one having trouble with basic comprehension. Yes, I understand that, I replied, trying to channel the patience of a kindergarten teacher explaining why we can't eat crayons. I don't want to go there. I'm just asking what you would have done if, hypothetically, I had wanted to go there. What followed was a 15-minute masterclass in circular reasoning that would have made Kafka weep into his diary. Despite being a fluent English speaker, my driver seemed to have a mental firewall that immediately blocked any sentence containing the word if. It was like watching someone try to explain color to a black and white TV. But you don't want to go there, he'd insist, with the kind of certainty usually reserved for fundamental laws of physics. I know I don't, but imagine if I did. But you don't. Yes, but what if? I already told you I won't take you there. It was like being caught in a logical loop designed by M.C. Escher. Each attempt to explain the concept of a hypothetical scenario just led us back to where we started, but somehow even more confused than before. The conversation had all the forward progress of a hamster wheel, but with less actual movement. By the end of the ride, I wasn't just astonished, I was fascinated. How had this man navigated through life without the ability to consider what-if scenarios? What were his financial decisions like? Did he have a retirement plan, or was the very concept of planning for the future too hypothetical? I found myself wanting to follow him home and create a reality TV show about his daily adventures in literal thinking. It would have been a hit, The Man Who Couldn't Imagine. As I stepped out of the car, still dazed from our philosophical merry-go-round, I couldn't help but wonder. If he couldn't handle hypothetical destinations, how did he deal with GPS navigation? In 200 feet, turn left, must sound like science fiction to him. Though I suppose asking that would have just started another round of. But we're not 200 feet away yet. Story 7. The Prankster's Comeuppance. In high school, I knew a guy who thought he was God's gift to comedy, though his idea of humor had all the sophistication of a whoopee cushion in a funeral home. Let's call him Tyler, the self-proclaimed king of pranks, whose reign was about as successful as a chocolate teapot. His practical jokes were nothing more than thinly veiled acts of aggression, and he derived an almost disturbing pleasure from people's angry reactions, like a cut-rate joker who shopped at Hot Topic. The warnings came frequently and clearly, like tornado sirens in Kansas. Teachers, students, even the janitor who'd seen it all, they all told him to knock it off with the nonsense. But Tyler, displaying the risk assessment skills of a lemming with a death wish, took these warnings as standing ovations. Each angry reaction just fueled his misguided sense of comedic genius, like throwing gasoline on a dumpster fire. His masterpiece of poor judgment came during what would become his final performance. The target? A quiet kid named Mike, whose hat apparently offended Tyler's delicate sensibilities. The first time Tyler knocked off Mike's hat, Mike calmly retrieved it and issued a warning so clear it could have been written in neon. Don't do that again. But Tyler, ever the artist, saw this as his cue for an encore. The second hat-knocking incident was met with Mike's remarkable composure. Looking Tyler dead in the eye, Mike delivered his final warning with the clarity of a crystal ball. Do it a third time, and I'll knock you out. It was like watching someone explain to a moth why it shouldn't fly into a flame. You knew the moth wasn't going to listen, but you had to admire the effort. What followed was a perfect example of cause and effect, like a physics demonstration in human form. Tyler, wearing what can only be described as the smuggest grin in human history, the kind of smile that makes even your friends want to punch you, knocked the hat off one final time. His expression suggested he thought he was starring in his own comedy special. Instead, he became the star of a very short action movie. Mike's response was as swift as it was predictable. The punch connected with the precision of a Swiss watch, sending Tyler spinning like a ballerina who'd had too much coffee. The look of absolute shock on Tyler's face as he went down was priceless, like someone who'd just discovered that actions, contrary to popular belief, do have consequences. His only response, delivered through a fog of confusion and dawning realization. What the hell, man? Chill out. It was like watching someone complain about getting wet after jumping into a pool. The absolute inability to connect his actions to their consequences was almost impressive in its completeness. The best part, not a single person came to his defense. The gathered crowd had all the sympathy of a traffic camera issuing a speeding ticket. Even the teachers who witnessed it somehow developed temporary blindness, presumably because they'd been secretly wanting to do the same thing for months. This incident marked the end of Tyler's illustrious career as a prankster. He'd written, directed, and starred in his own downfall, and the reviews were unanimously negative. Some say he learned his lesson that day, though rumor has it he still occasionally complains about how nobody can take a joke anymore. presumably while ducking instinctively whenever someone adjusts their hat. Story 8. The military's finest failure. In every military unit, there's always that one soldier who makes you question not just the recruitment process, but the entire concept of human evolution. Ours was Private Johnson, a walking disaster who elevated incompetence to an art form and made Forrest Gump look like a tactical genius. Our first encounter set the tone for what was to come. I discovered his weapon casually abandoned in a porta-potty, like some bizarre military-grade bathroom reading material. After returning it to his squad leader, I witnessed what would become a classic scene. Johnson performing rifle PT in full battle gear, adorned with a sign that read, "I forgot my weapon in the bathroom. Don't be like me. I'm a dumbass." This wasn't a one-time lapse. Losing weapons and gear became his signature move, like a magician whose only trick was making military equipment disappear. His brief transfer to another battalion proved spectacularly unsuccessful, as he returned for refusing to cut his hair and follow basic orders while deployed. Apparently, he thought the military's grooming standards were more like Pinterest inspiration boards, suggestions rather than requirements. His dramatic flair reached new heights when he once bellowed across the chow hall, "You don't see a D in my P." His creative way of expressing frustration about his ex-wife's dating life. The entire mess hall fell silent, not out of respect, but from the collective force of 300 simultaneous face-bombs. When he became my driver, things took a turn from merely amusing to absolutely surreal. Banned from alcohol due to his tendency to become white girl wasted and overdramatic, his words, not mine. He once threatened to turn himself in to the sheriff instead of reporting for duty, all because a girl rejected him on Tinder. When I called his bluff, he dissolved into tears, insisting it was my responsibility as his sergeant to fix his romantic problems. I'm pretty sure that wasn't covered in any leadership manual I'd ever read. His claims of being a webcam model came with the dubious assurance that he was showing his equipment only to women because you can tell. Spoiler alert, you can't. This led to an awkward conversation with the chaplain that probably violated several Geneva Convention protocols. Before a 2-week field exercise, he removed all his clean uniforms from his bags, apparently planning to channel his inner caveman. By day 3, his aroma had achieved biological weapon status. Other soldiers would dive into foxholes when he approached, not from enemy fire, but from the assault on their nostrils. The local wildlife started evacuating the area, and I'm pretty sure his smell violated several environmental protection laws. His pearls of wisdom included advice to scam the VA, collect food stamps, and join class action lawsuits, because apparently his life goal was to become a one-man drain on government resources. He genuinely believed the Army owed him sergeant stripes because he'd been in for 9 years, conveniently ignoring the fact that most of those years were spent perfecting new ways to avoid actual work. The final straw. He developed a habit of engaging in personal entertainment in the driver's hatch. Yes, you read that correctly. The man turned our tactical vehicle into his private pleasure palace, apparently believing that tactical position meant something entirely different. Eventually, I managed to guide him toward leaving the Army, a process that felt less like leadership and more like negotiating with a toddler who had gotten into the energy drinks. Now he collects $2,600 monthly from various assistance programs, living his best life as a professional government dependent. Whenever people express outrage about this, I pose a simple question. Do you really want this guy in the workforce? Sometimes keeping someone out of the job market is a public service, like putting a warning label on a bottle of bleach, but for society. These days, whenever I hear someone complain about government waste, I think about Private Johnson and realize that some people's greatest contribution to national defense is simply staying home. He might not have been the hero we wanted, but he was definitely the cautionary tale we needed. Story 9. Roy's Guide to Financial Ruin. Meet Roy, a self-proclaimed financial wizard whose approach to money management was about as sound as using a chocolate teapot. Roy had developed his own unique brand of economics, a system so spectacularly misguided it deserved its own chapter in financial horror stories. Right between setting money on fire for warmth and investing your life savings in magic beans. One day, he turned to me and a fellow crew member with the air of a sage about to impart ancient wisdom. "You boys want to know how to get nice things?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with the confidence of someone who had discovered the secret to unlimited wealth, but had somehow missed the concept of consequences. His master plan? Go to the store and finance everything, furniture, appliances, TVs, stereos, everything. Then don't make any payments and skip your court date. They'll garnish your wages, but they take way less than the payments would have been. The logic was so beautifully flawed it was like watching someone try to cure a hangover by getting drunk again. It was financial advice that would make Dave Ramsey spontaneously combust. But wait, there's more. A week later, Roy shared his revolutionary strategy for home ownership, delivered with the enthusiasm of a late-night infomercial host who'd had too much coffee. The plan was brilliantly simple in its absurdity. Apply for every credit card you can get, take out the maximum cash advance from all of them, use that for your down payment, then don't make any payments and skip your court date. It was like watching someone play Jenga with their credit score. Except instead of carefully removing pieces, Roy was suggesting taking a sledgehammer to the whole tower. His financial planning had all the foresight of a lemming leading a motivational seminar on cliff diving. The beauty of his system, according to Roy, was that it was basically free money, a concept that would have made economists throughout history simultaneously facepalm. He delivered his advice with the serene confidence of a chess master explaining why it's actually brilliant to sacrifice your queen on the first move. His theories about credit scores were particularly fascinating. He seemed to view them less as important financial indicators and more like high school grades, something that only matters until you decide it doesn't. Once it hits zero, he explained with the wisdom of a man who'd never tried to rent an apartment, it can't go any lower, so you're basically winning. For those wondering about Roy's eventual fate, I last spotted him about a decade ago in a small hamlet in Saskatchewan. Picture this, a man in his early 50s, sporting what can only be described as a magnificent gray-blonde skullet. That's a skull mullet for the uninitiated. Living his best life with all the carefree abandon of someone who had never heard of compound interest. He had evolved into his final form. A financial guru whose life was a testament to the principle that if you ignore your problems long enough, they become someone else's problems. His strategies weren't just thinking outside the box. They were throwing the box into a wood chipper and using the remains to file a fraudulent insurance claim. Sometimes I wonder if Roy is still out there, dispensing his unique brand of financial advice to unsuspecting listeners, his skullet flowing majestically in the prairie wind as he explains his latest theory about how bankruptcy is just a state of mind. His legacy lives on as a cautionary tale in the annals of personal finance, a reminder that sometimes the most valuable financial advice is knowing exactly what not to do. Story 10. The Flat Earth Financial Advisor. Meet James, a man who managed to turn debt dodging into an Olympic sport while simultaneously maintaining a worldview that would have made medieval scholars seem progressive. His approach to both finance and physics was unique, to say the least. Imagine someone trying to balance their checkbook while insisting that gravity is just a theory and that the earth is as flat as his credit score. His financial management style was a masterpiece of creative accounting. Debt collectors had become such regular features in his life that they'd practically earned honorary family member status. They'd call so often that his ringtone should have been another one bites the dust. His credit score had plummeted to depths that would make a deep-sea submarine feel inadequate, achieved through what can only be described as a determined commitment to fiscal irresponsibility. But James's real talent lay in his ability to simultaneously maintain financial chaos while developing increasingly elaborate theories about the shape of our planet. His expertise in high school mechanics class had led him to conclusions that would have made Isaac Newton not just turn in his grave, but probably attempt to escape it entirely. According to James's unique interpretation of physics, rockets couldn't work in space because there's no air to push against, a theory he explained with the confidence of someone who had personally tested this hypothesis. His astronomical calculations were equally impressive. The sun, he assured anyone who would listen, and many who would prefer not to, was a mere 6,000 miles away, a distance he had apparently determined through a complex series of calculations involving his thumb, the horizon, and what I can only assume was a heavy dose of creative mathematics. The atmosphere, he explained, must be contained in some sort of cosmic pressure vessel, or it would float away, a theory that somehow managed to misunderstand both gravity and the concept of floating simultaneously. But his crowning moment of scientific brilliance came during a particularly heated debate about the Earth's rotation. Standing in the middle of a parking lot, he executed what he clearly believed was a devastating demonstration of his theory. He jumped up and down, declaring triumphantly, "The Earth is rotating? Then why isn't it moving under my feet?" At that moment, I found myself wishing it had, preferably at escape velocity. His theories about technology were equally fascinating. Computers, according to James's unique understanding, learn tasks by playing YouTube videos in their brains, a concept that somehow managed to misunderstand both computers and brains in one elegant swoop. His master plan involved discovering Tesla's lost blueprints to invent something revolutionary in his backyard, despite struggling with the complex engineering challenge of assembling a bookshelf from IKEA. The cherry on top of this intellectual sundae, he claimed he could definitively prove the Earth was flat, but he was too busy taking his daughter swimming on Sundays to actually do so. It was a peculiar set of priorities that somehow managed to be both the most and least sensible thing about him, choosing family time over proving one of the most revolutionary scientific theories in history. What made James truly remarkable wasn't just his unique blend of financial chaos and scientific misconceptions. It was the absolute, unshakable confidence with which he presented his theories. He approached both his mounting debt and his flat earth beliefs with the same level of denial that a toddler applies to bedtime. His financial statements and his model of the solar system shared one key characteristic. They both existed in a reality of his own making. The last time I saw him, he was explaining to his daughter why the swimming pool water didn't curve with the Earth's surface. A lecture that was interrupted by a call from yet another debt collector. In that moment, watching him simultaneously dodge financial responsibility while teaching creative geography, I couldn't help but marvel at the human mind's capacity for compartmentalization. Sometimes I wonder if James ever managed to reconcile his flat Earth theories with his spherical debt pattern, or if he's still out there, dodging creditors while searching for the edge of the world. Though I suspect that even if he found it, he'd probably try to take out a loan against it. Story 11. The In-Laws' Adventure. Picture this. My in-laws recently graced us with their presence, staying at a nearby Airbnb because our place was too small, and frankly, my mother-in-law's unique personality had a tendency to test the limits of my sanity. What should have been a simple pickup turned into an epic saga of confusion and chaos, orchestrated by my mother-in-law's remarkable ability to transform the mundane into the extraordinary. The drama began during the short walk to my car. My mother-in-law, ever the observant soul, spotted what most people would dismiss as roadside debris, a crushed piece of metal. But in her eyes, this wasn't just any piece of metal. It was, apparently, a metallic amphibian masterpiece. "Look," she exclaimed with the enthusiasm of a child discovering Christmas had come early. "It looks exactly like a frog." Thus began an impromptu art appreciation session in the middle of the street, as she and my father-in-law engaged in a scholarly debate about the artistic merits of this flattened piece of trash that would have made art critics weep into their berets. They discussed its composition, its metaphorical significance, and its profound commentary on modern society with all the seriousness of curators analyzing a newly discovered Van Gogh. After finally coaxing them away from their street art discovery, a process that felt like herding cats through a fish market, we approached our parking spot. Now, you'd think someone who had been in my silver car countless times would recognize it, but my mother-in-law, in a display of spatial awareness that would have made a GPS system short-circuit, attempted to open the door of a random black car nearby. When I pointed out that my car was the silver one I was standing next to, she had the audacity to ask, with genuine confusion, why I was waiting by the wrong vehicle. The grand finale came when we reached my car, parked on a narrow, busy street. Instead of promptly getting in, they held up traffic while sea-urching for something to wrap their precious frog in, completely oblivious to the growing chorus of car horns behind us. When I finally lost patience and started ushering them into the car like a frustrated shepherd herding particularly stubborn sheep, my mother-in-law had the gall to quip. "You're talking to us like we're your 2-year-old son." I couldn't help but respond. No, my son is far more cooperative. And honestly, I wasn't even exaggerating. Story 12. The Chemistry Catastrophe. During my 3rd year of chemistry studies, we encountered titanium tetrachloride, TCl4, a substance so hazardous it could have starred in its own horror movie. Picture a chemical that reacts so violently with water that it produces hydrochloric acid and billowing clouds of toxic gas, the kind of substance that demands the utmost respect and careful handling. Our lab protocols were crystal clear: full protective gear, specialized containers, and strict confinement to the fume hood. But as in any good disaster story, there's always one person who thinks safety protocols are mere suggestions. Enter Mike, a walking advertisement for why some people shouldn't be allowed within 50 feet of a chemistry lab. Mike approached lab safety with all the caution of a toddler at a fireworks factory. His signature move? Treating hazardous chemicals like they were ingredients in a cooking show, complete with dramatic flourishes that would have made Gordon Ramsay have a nervous breakdown. On this particular day, Mike decided that the fume hood was too restrictive for his creative process. With the confidence of someone who had never experienced consequences, he declared, "It's fine, I'll just be really careful." Words that should automatically trigger emergency evacuation protocols in any lab setting. He proceeded to transfer the TCl4 with all the precision of a blindfolded juggler, treating the deadly compound like it was tap water. The inevitable happened when he managed to splash some on his lab coat. Instead of following emergency protocols, he decided that the best course of action was to rinse it off real quick, because apparently the warning about violent reactions with water had gone in one ear and out the other without encountering any resistance. The resulting reaction was like watching a miniature volcano erupt in slow motion, complete with clouds of acidic gas that had everyone in the vicinity questioning their career choices. The emergency shower activation that followed created a scene that would have made disaster movie directors take notes. Mike stood there, soaked and smoking slightly, with an expression that suggested he was still trying to process where his brilliant plan had gone wrong. The best part, his only comment as hazmat-suited emergency responders rushed in was, "I don't understand. Water usually makes things better." The lab had to be evacuated and decontaminated, which took 3 days and cost more than my entire college tuition. Mike was permanently banned from handling anything more dangerous than distilled water, though some argued that even that might be pushing it. Last I heard, he'd switched his major to theoretical physics, where at least his catastrophic misunderstandings wouldn't produce toxic gas clouds. To this day, whenever someone suggests taking a shortcut with safety protocols, I just say remember Mike, and watch as everyone within earshot involuntarily takes a step back from their workstation. Some lessons are best learned from a safe distance, preferably through someone else's spectacular failure. Story 13. The Future Science Teacher's Pregnancy Panic. Meet Jessica, a college senior majoring in science education who is about to provide the most compelling argument for improving sex education in schools that I've ever witnessed. Despite being weeks away from becoming a certified science teacher, her understanding of basic human biology appeared to have several critical gaps large enough to drive a school bus through. Our story begins when Jessica burst into the student lounge one day, face pale with panic, clutching her stomach like she was harboring an alien life form. "I think I'm pregnant," she announced to the room with all the dramatic flair of a soap opera star. Now, unexpected pregnancy scares aren't uncommon in college, but her reasoning for this conclusion was about to take us on a journey through the twilight zone of scientific misunderstanding. "I was swimming in the pool yesterday," she explained, her voice trembling with conviction. "And there were boys in it too,